I have a mind to become a mountebank in the streets, said one to the other. As well as to be a rag picker, exclaimed his friend. What an abominable situation, and no way out of it, not even the hope of it. One afternoon, it was the 20th of January, 1839, Bouvard, while at his desk, received a letter left by the postman. He lifted up both hands, then his head slowly fell back, and he sank on the floor in a swoon. The clerks rushed forward. They took off his cravat. They sent for a physician. He reopened his eyes. Then, in answer to the questions they put to him, the fact is, a little air will relieve me. No, let me alone. Kindly give me leave to go out. And in spite of his corpulence, he rushed, all breathless, to the Admiralty office and asked for Pécuchet. Pécuchet appeared. My uncle is dead. I am his heir. It isn't possible. Bouvard showed him the following lines. Office of Maître Tadivel, Notary. Sévignon-Septaine, 14th January, 1839. Sir, I beg of you to call at my office in order to take notice there of the will of your natural father, Monsieur François Denis Bartholomew Bouvard, ex-merchant in the town of Nantes, who died in this parish on the 10th of the present month. This will contains a very important disposition in your favor. Tardivel, Notary. Pécuchet was obliged to sit down on a boundary stone in the courtyard outside the office. Then he returned the paper, saying slowly, Provided that this is not some practical joke. You think it is a farce, replied Bouvard in a stifled voice, like the rattling in the throat of a dying man. But the postmark, the name of the notary's office in printed characters, the notary's own signature, all proved the genuineness of the news, and they regarded each other with a trembling at the corners of their mouths and tears in their staring eyes. They wanted space to breathe freely. They went to the Arc de Triomphe, came back by the water's edge, and passed beyond Notre Dame. Bouvard was very flushed. He gave Pécuchet blows with his fist in the back, and for 5 minutes talked utter nonsense. They chuckled in spite of themselves. This inheritance, surely, ought to mount up. Ah, that would be too much of a good thing. Let's talk no more about it. They did talk again about it. There was nothing to prevent them from immediately demanding explanations. Bouvard wrote to the notary with that view. The notary sent a copy of the will, which ended thus. Consequently, I give to François Denis Bartholomew Bouvard, my recognized natural son, the portion of my property disposable by law. The old fellow had got this son in his youthful days, but he had carefully kept it dark, making him pass for a nephew. And the nephew had always called him my uncle, though he had his own idea on the matter. When he was about 40, Monsieur Bouvard married. Then he was left a widower. His 2 legitimate sons having gone against his wishes, remorse took possession of him for the desertion of his other child during a long period of years. He would have even sent for the lad, but for the influence of his female cook. She left him, thanks to the manoeuvres of the family, and in his isolation, when death drew nigh, he wished to repair the wrongs he had done by bequeathing to the fruit of his early love all that he could of his fortune. It ran up to 500,000 francs, thus giving the copying clerk 250,000 francs. The eldest of the brothers, Monsieur Etienne, had announced that he would respect the will. Bouvard fell into a kind of stupefied condition. He kept repeating in a low tone, smiling with the peaceful smile of drunkards, an income of 15,000 livres. And Pécuchet, whose head, however, was stronger, was not able to get over it. They were rudely shaken by a letter from Tardivel. The other son, Monsieur Alexandre, declared his intention to have the entire matter decided by law, and even to question the legacy, if he could, requiring, first of all, to have everything sealed, and to have an inventory taken and a sequestrator appointed, etc. Bouvard got a bilious attack in consequence. Scarcely had he recovered when he started for Savigny. from which place he returned without having brought the matter nearer to a settlement, and he could only grumble about having gone to the expense of a journey for nothing. Then followed sleepless nights, alternations of rage and hope, of exultation and despondency. Finally, after the lapse of 6 months, his lordship Alexandre was appeased, and Bouvard entered into possession of his inheritance. His first exclamation was, "We will retire into the country." And this phrase, which bound up his friend with his good fortune, Pécuchet had found quite natural. For the union of these two men was absolute and profound. But, as he did not wish to live at Bouvard's expense, he would not go before he got his retiring pension. 2 years more, no matter. He remained inflexible, and the thing was decided. In order to know where to settle down, they passed in review all the provinces. The north was fertile but too cold, the south delightful, as far as the climate was concerned, but inconvenient because of the mosquitoes, and the middle portion of the country, in truth, had nothing about it to excite curiosity. Brittany would have suited them, were it not for the bigoted tendency of its inhabitants. As for the regions of the east, on account of the Germanic patois, they could not dream of it. But there were other places. For instance, what about Forêt, Bugey, and Roumois? The map said nothing about them. Besides, whether their house happened to be in one place or in another, the important thing was to have one. Already they saw themselves in their shirt sleeves, at the edge of a platband, pruning rose trees, and digging, dressing, settling the ground, growing tulips in pots. They would awaken at the singing of the lark to follow the plough. They would go with baskets to gather apples, would look on at butter-making, the thrashing of corn, sheep-shearing, bee-culture, and would feel delight in the lowing of cows and the scent of a new-mown hay. No more writing, no more heads of departments, no more even quarters' rent to pay, for they had a dwelling-house of their own, and they would eat the hens of their own poultry-yard, the vegetables of their own garden, and would dine without taking off their wooden shoes. We'll do whatever we like. We'll let our beards grow. They would purchase horticultural implements. Then a heap of things that might perhaps be useful, such as a tool chest. There was always need of one in a house. Next, scales and a land surveyor's chain, a bathing tub in case they got ill, a thermometer, and even a barometer on the Gay-Lussac system, for physical experiences, if they took a fancy that way. It would not be a bad thing either, for a person cannot always be working out of doors, to have some good literary works, and they looked out for them, very embarrassed sometimes to know if such a book was really a library book. Bouvard settled the question. "Oh, we shall not want a library. Besides, I have my own." They prepared their plans beforehand. Bouvard would bring his furniture, Pécuchet his big black table. They would turn the curtains to account, and, with a few kitchen utensils, this would be quite sufficient. They swore to keep silent about all this, but their faces spoke volumes. So their colleagues thought them funny. Bouvard, who wrote spread over his desk with his elbows out, in order the better to round his letters, gave vent to a kind of whistle while half-closing his heavy eyelids with a waggish air. Pécuchet, squatted on a big straw footstool, was always carefully forming the pothooks of his large handwriting, but all the while swelling his nostrils and pressing his lips together, as if he were afraid of letting his secret slip. After 18 months of inquiries, they had discovered nothing. They made journeys in all the outskirts of Paris, both from Amiens to Évreux and from Fontainebleau to Havre. They wanted a country place which should be a thorough country place, without exactly insisting on a picturesque site. But a limited horizon saddened them. They fled from the vicinity of habitations, and only redoubled their solitude. Sometimes they made up their minds. Then, fearing they would repent later, they changed their opinion, the place having appeared unhealthy, or exposed to the sea breeze, or too close to a factory, or difficult of access. Barbaroux came to their rescue. He knew what their dream was, and one fine day he called on them to let them know that he had been told about an estate at Chevignol, between Caen and Falaise. This comprised a farm of 38 hectares, with a kind of chateau and a garden in a very productive state. They proceeded to Calvados, and were quite enraptured. For the farm, together with the house, one would not be sold without the other. Only 143,000 francs were asked. Bouvard did not want to give more than 120,000. Pécuchet combated his obstinacy, begged of him to give way, and finally declared that he would make up the surplus himself. This was his entire fortune, coming from his mother's patrimony and his own savings. Never had he breathed a word, reserving this capital for a great occasion. The entire amount was paid up about the end of 1840, 6 months before his retirement. Bouvard was no longer a copying clerk. At first he had continued his functions through distrust of the future, but he had resigned once he was certain of his inheritance. However, he willingly went back to Messieurs de Cambon, and the night before his departure he stood drinks to all the clerks. Pécuchet, on the contrary, was morose towards his colleagues, and went off on the last day, roughly clapping the door behind him. He had to look after the packing, to do a heap of commissions, then to make purchases, and to take leave of Dumouchel. The professor proposed to him an epistolary interchange between them, of which he would make use, to keep Pécuchet well up in literature, and, after fresh felicitations, wished him good health. Barberoux exhibited more sensibility in taking leave of Bouvard. He expressly gave up a domino party, promised to go see him over there, ordered 2 aniseed cordials, and embraced him. Bouvard, when he got home, inhaled over the balcony a deep breath of air, saying to himself, "At last." The lights along the quays quivered in the water. The rolling of omnibuses in the distance gradually ceased. He recalled happy days spent in this great city, supper parties at restaurants, evenings at the theatre, gossips with his portress, all his habitual associations. And he experienced a sinking of the heart, a sadness which he dared not acknowledge even to himself. Pécuchet was walking in his room up to 2 o'clock in the morning. He would come back there no more, so much the better. And yet, in order to leave behind something of himself, he printed his name on the plaster over the chimney-piece. The larger portion of the baggage was gone since the night before. The garden implements, the bedsteads, the mattresses, the tables, the chairs, a cooking apparatus, and 3 casks of Burgundy would go by the Seine, as far as Havre, and would be dispatched thence to Caen, where Bouvard, who would wait for them, would have them brought on to Chavignol. But his father's portrait, the armchairs, the liquor case, the old books, the timepiece, all the precious objects were put into a furniture wagon, which would proceed through Nonancourt, Verneuil, and Falaise. Pécuchet was to accompany it. He installed himself beside the conductor upon a seat, and, wrapped up in his oldest frock-coat, with a comforter, mittens, and his office foot-warmer, on Sunday the 20th of March, at daybreak, he set forth from the capital. The movement and the novelty of the journey occupied his attention during the first few hours. Then the horses slackened their pace, which led to disputes between the conductor and the driver. They selected execrable inns, and, though they were accountable for everything, Pécuchet, through excess of prudence, slept in the same lodgings. Next day they started again, at dawn, and the road, always the same, stretched out, uphill, to the verge of the horizon. Yards of stones came after each other. The ditches were full of water. The country showed itself in wide tracts of green, monotonous and cold. Clouds scudded through the sky. From time to time there was a fall of rain. On the 3rd day squalls arose. The awning of the wagon, badly fastened on, went clapping with the wind, like the sails of a ship. Pécuchet lowered his face under his cap, and every time he opened his snuff-box it was necessary for him, in order to protect his eyes, to turn round completely. During the joltings he heard all his baggage swinging behind him, and shouted out a lot of directions. Seeing that they were useless, he changed his tactics. He assumed an air of good fellowship, and made a display of civilities. In the troublesome ascents, he assisted the men in pushing on the wheels. He even went so far as to pay for the coffee and brandy after the meals. From that time, they went on more slowly, so much so that in the neighborhood of Gaubourg, the axle-tree broke, and the wagon remained tilted over. Pécuchet immediately went to inspect the inside of it. The sets of porcelain lay in bits. He raised his arms while he gnashed his teeth, and cursed these two idiots. And the following day was lost, owing to the wagon driver getting tipsy. But he had not the energy to complain, the cup of bitterness being full. Bouvard had quitted Paris only on the third day, as he had to dine once more with Barberoux. He arrived in the coach-yard at the last moment. Then he woke up before the Cathedral of Rouen. He had mistaken the diligence. In the evening, all the places for Caen were booked. Not knowing what to do, he went to the Theatre of Arts, and he smiled at his neighbors, telling them he had retired from business and had lately purchased an estate in the neighborhood. When he started on Friday for Caen, his packages were not there. He received them on Sunday and dispatched them in a cart, having given notice to the farmer who was working the land that he would follow in the course of a few hours. At Falaise, on the 9th day of his journey, Pécuchet took a fresh horse, and even till sunset they kept steadily on. Beyond Bretteville, having left the high road, he got off into a crossroad, fancying that every moment he could see the gable ends of Chavignol. However, the ruts hid them from view. They vanished, and then the party found themselves in the midst of ploughed fields. The night was falling. What was to become of them? At last, Pécuchet left the wagon behind, and, splashing in the mire, advanced in front of it to reconnoitre. When he drew near farmhouses, the dogs barked. He called out as loudly as ever he could, asking what was the right road. There was no answer. He was afraid, and got back to the open ground. Suddenly 2 lanterns flashed. He perceived a cabriolet, and rushed forward to meet it. Bouvard was inside. But where could the furniture wagon be? For an hour they called out to it through the darkness. At length it was found, and they arrived at Chavignol. A great fire of brushwood and pineapples was blazing in the dining room. 2 covers were placed there. The furniture, which had come by the cart, was piled up near the vestibule. Nothing was wanting. They sat down to table. Onion soup had been prepared for them. Also a chicken, bacon, and hard-boiled eggs. The old woman who cooked came from time to time to inquire about their tastes. They replied, "Oh, very good, very good." And the big loaf, hard to cut, the cream, the nuts, all delighted them. There were holes in the flooring, and the damp was oozing through the walls. However, they cast around them a glance of satisfaction while eating on the little table, on which a candle was burning. Their faces were reddened by the strong air. They stretched out their stomachs. They leaned on the backs of their chairs, which made a cracking sound in consequence, and they kept repeating, "Here we are in the place, then. What happiness! It seems to me that it is a dream." Although it was midnight, Pécuchet conceived the idea of taking a turn round the garden. Bouvard made no objection. They took up the candle, and, screening it with an old newspaper, walked along the paths. They found pleasure in mentioning aloud the names of the vegetables. "Look here, carrots! Ah, cabbages!" Next, they inspected the espalier. Pécuchet tried to discover the buds. Sometimes a spider would scamper suddenly over the wall, and the 2 shadows of their bodies appeared magnified, repeating their gestures. The ends of the grass let the dew trickle out. The night was perfectly black, and everything remained motionless in a profound silence, an infinite sweetness. In the distance, a cock was crowing. Their 2 rooms had between them a little door, which was hidden by the papering of the wall. By knocking a chest of drawers up against it, nails were shaken out, and they found the place gaping open. This was a surprise. When they had undressed and got into bed, they kept babbling for some time. Then they went to sleep, Bouvard on his back, with his mouth open, his head bare, Pécuchet on his right side, his knees in his stomach, his head muffled in a cotton nightcap, and the pair snored under the moonlight, which made its way in through the windows.